Which countries pose the greatest risk to Canada's democracy, and what are their tactics? Let's bring in our two security experts. Wesley Wark is a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and Stephanie Carvin is an associate professor of international relations at Carleton University. Great to have you both.
Good to be here.
Wesley, let me start with you. It feels like, foreign interference has become a common phrase the past 10 years, but I don't always tie it in with disinformation. The commissioner did that very clearly. What do you think she was really trying to warn us about?
Well, the commission, interestingly, had a mandate to look back and to look forward. And in looking back, it was really talking about traditional foreign interference, a kind of human-on-human contacts that try and wield influence behind the scenes using proxies on the part of various states. Looking forward, and this was the interesting part of her report that you referenced, she was saying, and it's quite, I think, hyperbolic language, that there's an existential threat to Canadian elections in the future, democratic processes that is really based on the potential for foreign states to interfere in our information space and to circulate disinformation of various kinds. So that's the future threat she was talking about. I think we're kind of caught in the middle between, looking back and looking forward in terms of this present election.
Yeah, it's always a question, is a future threat right now? Stephanie, foreign interference isn't new. Disinformation isn't new, as the commissioner outlined very well in her report. What made this inquiry then so important for Canada leading up to the 45th election?
I think to a certain extent, we have seen this kind of drip of information about cases of foreign interference that may not have been reported or may have gone undetected. And that was kind of creating a crisis of confidence around our democratic institutions. I think to a certain extent, ironically, the government was prepared to look for online foreign interference, especially after the 2016 elections where Trump was elected almost certainly with the assistance of Russia. And I think that was the model, but they didn't see the kind of in-person clandestine foreign interference that really was kind of the hallmark or what inspired this commission. So I think it was important to reassure Canadians that their elections had been free and fair, and to identify problems that could prevent future elections from being free and fair.
Yeah, to make all of us just a little bit more aware. Wesley,
Yeah.
I read an article you wrote for The Line magazine where you wrote, "The attention paid to disinformation by the inquiry is one of its greatest strengths." What is at stake for Canadians if we don't treat this as a threat?
Well, again, I think it's important to pay attention. I think we are paying attention. This is one of the great changes in 2025 compared to certainly the past elections in 2019 and 2021. Everyone is paying attention. The media, political actors, the public in general, I think, is paying attention to the possibility of foreign interference of various kinds, whether the traditional kind that is the focus for some of our intelligence agencies, or the more digital kind in terms of online disinformation. So, but the challenge, I think, is, and we experienced this in the past, how to understand the threat proportionally. It's certainly out there. How significant might it be? And we have to make a distinction, I think, between efforts at foreign interference, and we haven't seen really much of those so far in 2025, and impacts. And I think, my own prediction could well be wrong or right. My own prediction is that I think the circumstances of the federal election in 2025 don't give a lot of traction really to foreign interference attempts, particularly in the context where people are paying so much more attention to these than they were in the past.
Okay, because we know more, maybe that deters some people. In the run-up to April 28th, of course, Canada has created SITE, a Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, to monitor foreign interference. And just this week, they detected inauthentic narratives about Liberal leader Mark Carney on WeChat, the Chinese social media platform people know. And that site features a very popular news site called Youmian. And here's what site officials found.
This information operation had contrasting positive and negative narratives, first amplifying Mr. Carney's stance with the United States, and then targeting his experience and credentials. The SITE task force assesses that the foreign state-backed information operation was intended to influence Canadian Chinese communities and look to mold perceptions about the candidate.
So Stephanie, help me understand why a foreign government would want to do something like that. Like, what is the return, I guess, on investment?
That's such an odd case. And I will just, give a little side note here that this actually was the first time the site task force had actually identified an incident where there had been an attempt at foreign interference, right? And now, of course, they weren't saying that Canada's ability to have a free and fair election was compromised in any way, but it is noteworthy that they came forward. And it's interesting because, looking at those messages that they identified, they're not really like hyperbolic or glowing narratives or anything like this. Like, it's not like one of them is like, some of them are clearly approving of Mark Carney, but they're pretty tame. And so there's a number of reasons why they could have done this. One would potentially be just to test the waters. One of the things we do know, and I agree very much with what Professor Wark said, which is, we have to be proportional in understanding how foreign interference is working in this election. But we also have to be aware that states are always adapting their techniques, right? And this is the same group that was caught targeting Michael Chong last year, as well as Chrystia Freeland early this year as she was pursuing the Liberal leadership, right? So one of the things is, they could have been adapting. Maybe they thought this was a really powerful narrative by some means. And the other thing is, too, we have to be careful here because, this attempt was amplifying an account, and the group which actually, amplified the account is different from the account which actually sent out the message in the first place. So there could actually even be competing reasons for that message to have been put out there. Lots of different factors to take into consideration. But I think the key thing to keep in mind, it's not necessarily, the point isn't necessarily to try and understand the motivation. It's to catch the attempt. Right? It's to catch the fact that states are doing this in the first place.
Which we did. Even though 1 to 3 million views of that content, our site task force caught that, alerted Canadians about it. Wesley, are we prepared then to fend off operations like that, at least be able to tell Canadians about it?
Well, I think the really interesting kind of new approach that's being taken in 2025 is the site task force that you're talking about is actually coming out in public in ways that it didn't do in 2019 and 2021. It's been around for quite a long time. But it's coming out in public and making these announcements about what it's seen. And as Stephanie indicated, the very first announcement about an alleged foreign interference campaign was issued only very recently. It has to be said, I agree entirely with Stephanie about this. It's a pretty tame message. It's the kind of thing that you might well see on any Canadian mainstream media, just providing a report on Mark Carney. It's not the sort of message that's clearly designed to, I don't think, steer Canadians, if they're receptive, steer Canadians in any particular direction. So the question is, well, why did the site task force feel compelled to call public attention to this report? And I think really what they're demonstrating, and they have to be very careful about this, what they're demonstrating is, and this again supports, I think, something Stephanie said, we have the capacity, we're monitoring this, we're on the lookout for ways in which social media apps like WeChat, for example, may be used in the future, even in the next couple or 3 weeks of the election, to include some more misleading, genuine disinformation campaigns, the kind that wasn't clearly involved in this particular one. So we have the technology to follow this. But, the government has to be very careful, and this is an old problem. The government has to be very careful in not engaging in any kind of counter narrative, so not trying to kind of meddle in the information space itself during an election. And so this is why you saw with the site task force release, that they don't really say very much about the content of these messages. They don't actually even translate them. So presumably Stephanie did what I did, which was put them in a translation machine and try and read them. And
you may not be the target, Wesley. You may not be the target, right? It's the Chinese Canadian communities, right?
Right, absolutely.
Wesley, Stephanie, great to have you on the show.
Thank you.